This happened years ago, when I was a teenager attending Camp Ramley in the summer. Camp Ramley was a week-long overnight camp in South County, Rhode Island. Alternating weeks of girls and boys. Groups were around 20 to 25 people. Pretty small. The camp consisted of a main camping area, made up of cabins for counselors, campers, and a large shared campfire where we would tell scary stories and toast marshmallows. There was a kitchen and dining area about a mile walk from the main campsite, as well as a private beach and acres of thick forest surrounding everything. We had just finished a campfire session where the counselors scared all the young ones with tales of monsters and crazy people that lived in the forest. My 7 tent mates, being rowdy adolescent boys, were not ready to go settle down just yet. So we spent the next 45 minutes talking about ghosts, monsters, and wild forest folk. Being that we were all invincible at the time, we all discussed the endless ways that we would be able to fight them one-on-one, in the event that we should stumble upon them in the woods some fateful night. The raucous camaraderie and merriment soon died down, and we all settled into our individual bunks to doze off for the night. A voice broke the silence all of a sudden. It was Tim, one of the campers, who now had to take the biggest piss of his life. He wanted someone to go outside with him. I can't say I completely blamed him. As we were in the middle of the woods, it was pitch black and completely silent, aside from the sounds of the woods themselves. I'm not sure why he didn't just open the back flaps of the tent and go there, but he was intent on having company for this bathroom break, and he was not going to stop asking until someone stepped up. I finally jumped off my bunk and told him I'd take him. We stepped out of the tent and started walking. Tim was absolutely terrified. He put his hands on my shoulders while we walked, the entire time shaking and hyperventilating. I walked him to a small clearing maybe 100 feet away, where he could comfortably use the facilities. He turned away from me to begin. I turned around as well, looking off into the dark, facing the campsite. After a few moments, I felt a chill come over me, and a strange silence covered the woods like a blanket. This would be the first time I felt this particular phenomenon, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. As I stared off into the abyss stared back. 15 feet away from me, I saw a black silhouette moving with the night. My initial thought was that it was one of the counselors, stepping out to investigate the noise of Tim and myself. As it passed closer to me, I realized that I was seeing a figure of a woman from another time entirely. She adorned a large Victorian-era dress, billowing out at the bottom. She wore a large brimmed sun hat with a big bow on the side of it. Although I could see the outline of her and her clothing, I couldn't make out many details beyond that. I was spellbound as this woman floated by me so nonchalantly, and quite literally disappeared into the dense brush. A few moments after, the strange feeling passed, and I once again escorted Tim back to the tent. I didn't even ask if he saw her too. It was definitely time for bed. I saw a southern Belle in Rhode Island. In 2022, we set up a camp on some private land in northern Vermont, on the edge of the Canadian border. We cleared some paths, dug out a fire pit, and set up a huge tent for camping. We had a makeshift outhouse and the whole nine. It was a few hundred feet off a private road with several residents down the road. The property we were on was over 10 acres, of mostly pine and cedar trees. Our campsite was flanked on either side by empty acres of field and trees. It was peaceful, but also slightly eerie. You could see remnants of things left to the mercy of the forest, like an old road and a wood stove that the woods was slowly eating. We went there often during that summer. One of our first nights there, we noticed some weirdness. We were hanging out with the owner of the property around the campfire one night. When it came time for her to walk home, I walked her up to the road and bid her good night. I was heading back down to the fire when I heard a loud whack, the clear sound of a stick hitting a tree. The area it came from was swampy and not exactly passable, and we had heard no other sound. I paused on the path and heard it a second time. I hurried back to the campsite. We heard similar sounds throughout the night. My friend reported hearing the knocks as she walked home and admitted that it quickened her pace. While I was sleeping, I could feel what felt like heavy, running bipedal footsteps through our campsite. In the morning, I recounted my experience to a neighbor who said that she had heard similar stories. My friend's son said that in his time camping in the woods in his makeshift shelter, he had been kept awake many a night, feeling like he was being surrounded or stalked. Later that day, I went down to the creek and looked across into the adjoining acreage and saw a red colonial-style house peeping out at me from the trees. I thought nothing of it until I realized that there was nobody living there. The property was completely empty. We returned to our site the next time to find tears in our tent. We reckoned it must have been from a bear. Taping them up, we went about our day. It was hard to ignore, though, and that night, it was even harder to sleep. Eventually, we stopped going up there. But I often still think about that night with the footsteps. I have no explanation, and don't know if I ever will. My friend used to tell her kids to be careful, or Pigman would get them. I used to think this was just legend, but now I'm wondering, maybe there really was something in those woods. This was ages ago, but in 8th grade, our school sent us to spend a week at a nature camp. I can't remember where it was. I think Bryant Pond in Maine, but it was so many decades ago I cannot be sure. I have a few memories of that trip. We all got to spend one night on an island, got to canoe over to it to spend the night. I remember being grossed out by our plates and eating utensils because they were greasy and gross, and the counselors told us they were fine. Anyway, we cleaned up the next morning, loaded up the canoes. Due to that, there was not enough room in the canoes for everyone, so I had to stay back and my friend would come back and get me when they unloaded. No big deal. I enjoyed the beach until they came back. It's important to say none of us were sketched out or nervous about anything, except getting pooped on by the loons. My friend arrives. I hop in the canoe and off we go. We're laughing, being typical silly girls having fun. Until I drop my oar in the water. We spin around, having fun pretending I can't reach the oar. And out of the water comes this arm. It's muscled, clawed, and covered in ginger-colored hair. I'm surprised we didn't swamp the canoe in our hysterics. My friend grabbed the oar and told me to paddle, now. We got back to camp in hysterics. I called my folks to come get me. They did not, and did not believe me. My friend's mom came and got her, and called my folks to say she would bring me back if it was okay. This was so long ago, but that arm, I can still see it so clearly. One summer, we were camping for 2 nights at Charge Pond at Myles Standish State Forest. We were 2 families coming from different states and had 2 campsites right next to each other. The sites were roomy and fairly private, surrounded by thick brush. We backed in, set up our tents, and got to the business of watching the kids scooter around while we grabbed a bunch of food over a crackling fire and catching up. The first night turned out to be super still and eerily quiet. I tend to have trouble sleeping outside of my home, but this night was quite extreme. The campground settled, but so did any possible noise in the forest. No crickets, no birds, nothing. I swear I could hear someone if they coughed across the park. It was jarring and weird, and I got about 2 hours of sleep that night, stuck in my hypervigilance. The next morning, I was able to keep myself together with some highly caffeinated coffee, and was looking forward to going to sleep as I assumed I would be so beat I would crash instantly. Wrong. I tossed and turned for nearly 3 hours before finally falling asleep. In that time, I heard some odd sounds. The forest ambiance was a bit more lively this night. There was a slight breeze, and crickets were doing their thing. I was awake long past when everyone else fell asleep about 11. I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps approaching the tent. My ears would perk up, and I would freeze to figure out what it was. I would become pretty positive it was something or someone walking around the campsite. But then my husband would shift in the sleeping bag, and the noise stopped. So I figured it was just noises in the forest. This happened about 3 times, and each time the exact same thing happened, except that maybe the breeze would move through the trees, or our kid would make a noise. Finally, I assumed I was imagining things, and I was able to fall asleep. The next morning, we awoke to a few things in the campsite slightly skewed. I talked to our family in the neighboring site, and it turns out they had experienced virtually the same thing, beginning shortly after midnight. Footsteps that they swore were footsteps, but then brushed off about 3 times. I shuddered to think that maybe a prowler was tiptoeing through our campsites. I shuddered to wonder what it had been, if not a prowler. Good old Myles Standish never disappoints in bringing the creepiness.